Could a practice as ancient as simply not eating fundamentally shift how we approach cancer treatment today?
It sounds pretty radical, doesn't it?
It really does. But cutting-edge research is asking exactly that question.
It's actually one of the most compelling areas right now where, these very old human practices meet modern molecular biology.
Yeah.
The science behind how nutrient availability impacts our cells, well, it's revealing potential new strategies.
Yeah.
Especially relevant in oncology, I think.
And that's precisely what we're diving into today. We're taking a deep dive using source material you provided, focusing specifically on the current science around fasting and cancer. Mm-hmm. Our stack includes recent research findings, some clinical insights, and of course the essential definitions we need to get everyone on the same page.
Right. And our mission with this deep dive is really focused.
Mm-hmm.
Let's unpack the key scientific nuggets from these sources. We want to synthesize what the current evidence actually says about potentially integrating fasting with conventional cancer therapy.
Which is becoming critical knowledge, right? Yeah. Especially for health professionals navigating these complex treatment landscapes.
Absolutely. Understanding the science here is, well, it's increasingly important.
Okay, let's start at the beginning then. Let's get a clear definition from the sources. What exactly are we talking about when we say fasting in this specific context?
Good starting point.
Yeah.
So according to one of our key sources, we're really focusing on voluntary water fasting.
Okay, just water.
Just water. It's the practice of consuming only water for a defined period. And that period could be, say, 24 hours, or it might go up to several days.
And critically, no food.
Critically, no food, no caloric drinks, and also no supplements that would give you energy or nutrients. Purely water.
And the immediate effect of, cutting off that nutrient supply, what happens metabolically?
The body undergoes this really fundamental metabolic shift. It stops running primarily on glucose.
Mm-hmm.
The sugar, that's its preferred fuel when food's around.
Yeah.
And it transitions to using stored fats instead. This whole process leads to the production of something called ketone bodies.
Ah, ketosis.
Exactly, entering a state known as ketosis.
So the fuel source changes quite dramatically. What does that switch actually trigger physiologically? What responses happen inside the body?
Well, the shift kicks off a whole cascade of cellular and hormonal changes. You see a pretty significant drop in insulin levels.
That's a key growth hormone, right?
A very key hormone, yeah. It signals growth and nutrient availability, so less insulin. Also, fasting seems to induce cellular repair processes, most notably autophagy.
Autophagy, that's like the cell's internal cleaning crew.
That's a great way to put it. It's like the cell's recycling program, cleaning out damaged or unnecessary components. And then there are broader changes in hormone signaling pathways too, ones that are sensitive to nutrient status.
Okay, so this is where it starts to get really interesting for cancer, isn't it? How do normal, healthy cells handle this state of nutrient scarcity compared to cancer cells?
Yeah, this is crucial. The preclinical studies detailed in the sources, they highlight a really critical differential impact.
Okay.
When faced with nutrient deprivation, like during a fast, healthy cells are actually remarkably adaptable. They can sort of switch into a protective mode, a lower energy state.
They dial things down.
Exactly. They dial down their metabolic engines and really prioritize survival and maintenance over growth.
But cancer cells, their whole defining thing is often relentless growth, fueled by mutations. They don't usually have that same off switch, do they?
That's precisely the issue for them. Cancer cells are often metabolically inflexible. They're driven by these archogenic signals that just scream grow, 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 regardless of the conditions outside.
Right.
They have incredibly high metabolic demands, and they're heavily reliant on a steady supply of glucose and other nutrients. So they really struggle to adapt to these lean conditions induced by fasting, much more so than their healthy neighbors.
So the really profound implication here, suggested by this differential response, is that fasting might be a way to make healthy cells more resilient to treatments like chemo, while at the same time making cancer cells more vulnerable because they're already stressed out by the lack of fuel.
That's the core hypothesis being explored, yes.
Yeah.
And the sources point to several key scientific mechanisms behind this. One that's particularly fascinating is the impact on insulin-like growth factor 1, IGF-1.
IGF-1, okay, tell me about that.
So it's a hormone quite similar in structure to insulin, actually, and it promotes cell growth and division. The problem is high levels of IGF-1 are frequently linked to increased cancer risk and progression.
And fasting brings those levels down. significantly.
It does, quite significantly. So by reducing IGF-1, fasting can essentially dampen those downstream signaling pathways that are crucial for tumor growth, things like the PI3 actinium-2 pathway.
Which is often hyperactive in cancer.
Very often hyperactive, yes. So it's like turning down a key growth signal that the cancer cells are desperately trying to amplify.
You also mentioned autophagy earlier, that cellular cleanup process. How does that fit into the mechanism picture?
Right, autophagy, fasting, is a potent inducer of it. Now, its role in cancer is complex, it has to be said, but this process of clearing out damaged organelles and misfolded proteins, it could potentially help maintain the health and integrity of normal cells.
And maybe even remove precancerous cells?
Possibly. There's some thought it might even play a role in removing those precancerous cells before they properly develop. It's an active area of research.
And let's circle back to that metabolic shift, the ketogenesis we talked about initially. That low glucose, high ketone environment is really key here, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely central.
Yeah.
As we noted, cancer cells often have this altered metabolism. They guzzle glucose. That's the famous Warburg effect.
Right.
So the low glucose, high ketone environment created during fasting is, well, metabolically hostile for many types of tumors.
Because they find it hard to actually use ketones for fuel.
Precisely. While most of our normal cells can readily switch over to burning fatty acids and ketones when glucose gets scarce, many cancer cells lack this metabolic flexibility.
Okay.
This puts significant metabolic stress on those tumor cells, potentially leading to their death, while the normal cells, which can adapt, are relatively spared. That's the hope anyway.
Okay. That lays out the preclinical science and the proposed mechanisms pretty clearly. So let's move from the lab bench. Where does the evidence stand in actual human trials? What do the clinical insights from the sources tell us?
Well, we're starting to see some movement there. Some early phase clinical trials have begun investigating the feasibility and the potential impact of using fasting, or these things called fasting mimicking diets, in patients who are undergoing chemotherapy.
And one of the sources brings up a study specifically in breast cancer patients.
Yes, that particular trial gets cited quite often. It suggested that patients who used a fasting mimicking diet, which aims to get some benefits of fasting without complete food restriction around their chemo cycles.
Yeah.
They reported fewer and less severe side effects compared to the control group.
That sounds significant. Better tolerance.
It's an important early signal, suggesting maybe some protection of healthy cells and definitely improved treatment tolerance in that group. But again, early phase.
We also hear quite a bit anecdotally from patients themselves, don't we? Personal stories about feeling better or managing side effects more effectively when they tried fasting approaches.
We do. And, while those personal accounts are incredibly compelling and certainly shouldn't be dismissed on a human level,
right,
it's just vital from a scientific standpoint to remember they aren't controlled clinical evidence. They can definitely inspire research questions, absolutely, and highlight potential benefits to explore further.
But they don't replace the need for the rigorous trials.
Exactly. They don't replace the need for those really well-designed clinical trials to definitively establish safety and, importantly, efficacy.
Which brings us squarely to the really essential considerations and risks that the sources highlight. Fasting is not a one-size-fits-all approach, is it? Especially for people undergoing serious medical treatment.
No, absolutely not. And this point cannot be stressed enough. The sources are crystal clear. Fasting is contraindicated, meaning it shouldn't be done for many patients.
Like who specifically?
Well, this includes individuals who have certain pre-existing medical conditions.
Yeah.
Also, anyone who is underweight or at risk of malnutrition. That's a big one.
Makes sense.
Or patients who are on particularly complex or intensive treatment regimens where getting enough nutrition is absolutely paramount.
So the take-home message is a conversation with your entire healthcare team is completely non-negotiable before even thinking about this.
It is the single most critical step, period. Any discussion, any thought about incorporating fasting or any significant dietary change must happen with a qualified healthcare professional, someone who understands your specific condition, your treatment plan, everything. The goal is always to ensure that any intervention doesn't compromise your overall health, your nutritional status, or, crucially, the effectiveness of your conventional therapy. Medical supervision is absolutely essential if this path is even considered.
Okay. So, pulling all of this together now, what's the current synthesis? What's the overall picture presented in the sources we looked at?
I'd say the sources position fasting as a really fascinating and definitely promising area within cancer research. The mechanisms we discussed, They strongly suggest it could potentially enhance treatment efficacy.
Boost the chemo or radiation?
Potentially, yes. And also mitigate some of those difficult side effects by, exploiting those metabolic differences between healthy and cancerous cells.
But the overarching takeaway, coming through loud and clear from the evidence section, is the urgent need for more and better clinical trials.
Precisely. While the preclinical data is exciting and those early human signals are encouraging, we are still very much in the early stages. Definitive evidence. Things like the optimal fasting protocols, long-term safety, the actual impact on survival rates, and figuring out which specific cancer types or patient groups might benefit most. That all requires large-scale, properly controlled trials.
So until that evidence is in hand.
Until that evidence is properly established, using fasting as an adjunct therapy in oncology requires significant caution and, as we said, close professional oversight. It's promising, but handle with care.
And as we always emphasize for any topic touching on health and treatment in these deep dives, this conversation, based entirely on the sources you provided, is strictly for informational purposes.
Absolutely. It does not in any way, shape, or form constitute medical advice. Your medical care, your treatment plan, should always be managed in direct consultation with your qualified healthcare professional.
Please do not make any changes to your treatment plan based on this discussion without their explicit guidance and approval.
Crucial point.
So, thinking about everything we've unpacked today, how might this evolving understanding of, cellular metabolism and nutrient signaling, how might it shape the future landscape of integrative approaches in oncology? It's a powerful question, isn't it? Especially for you listening, if you're a health professional, something to reflect on as the science continues to unfold.
The potential is definitely significant, but, navigating it safely and effectively really requires building that strong base of evidence we've been talking about.
If you found value in this exploration today, you can join us for these deep dive sessions every single week.
And remember, you can also explore more deep dives and find additional content over on our YouTube channel.